de una plataforma de distribución de los contenidos es muy importante.
Prnoticias entrevista a Paul Thompson, experto en Public Affairs en Reino Unido, donde ha trabajado para la Organización Nacional de las Artes y para el regulador de las telecomunicaciones, así como para el Parlamento en colaboración con el diputado laborista Miliband. Thompson da las claves de los cambios que se han producido en los últimos años en el panorama de los Public Affairs y cómo los cambios políticos pueden afectar a la profesión.
I would say that because there's been a massive change in the political landscape, but also in the communications landscape, that the public affairs professional has been forced to change. So if we go back 10, 15 years ago, you might have been able to get by on the strength of your contacts and the strength of your relationships, but that no longer would really wash with a large corporate or a medium-sized business. Public affairs professionals are expected to be highly professional, highly disciplined in terms of how they engage. They're seen as a valued member of the senior team and expected to offer strong, credible advice on a commercial basis to help protect the commercial reputation of a company or organisation. So in that sense, it's completely changed. I'd also say that there's been a big change in terms of how the public affairs professional is seen by senior leaderships within a company. The way in which public affairs has also changed has been in terms of how we manage our relationships with our external stakeholders. So it's no longer good enough to perhaps say, perhaps I'll have a meeting with this contact every 6 months. The relationships that we have with our stakeholder are really critical to the success of a business. So we have to be constantly thinking about the interests of different stakeholders outside of a company. Have to always be thinking about, have we really made real efforts to engage with them and understand their point of view, even if they are opposed to what we think as a company. It's really important for the public affairs professional to take the time to sit down to understand that point of view, take it back into the company. So in terms of the political situation, it is quite fascinating to notice what is happening and what has been happening in Spain. So the rapid increase in smaller parties in Spain has completely, it seems, shaken up the political establishment here. In terms of using things like social media, it's quite fascinating how that has happened. And social media within the British political scene is an important tool, and many more politicians, political parties, companies, others are using social media in a normal way. So actually I think people will be looking to parties that have used social media in a much more effective way and thinking about how they can incorporate that into their own political strategies and communication strategies. So in the UK we had a coalition government until recently between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and it did, from a public affairs perspective, did really change, and in many ways actually I think improve the way that businesses engaged with government. So one big thing that businesses will need to think about is obviously not just the position of one party who they may have been dealing with for many, many years. In a coalition, you need to think about obviously the different political trade-offs between each of the parties in office. That might be hard work. It might require a lot more kind of intellectual capacity to think through the problems, but it's a real opportunity for public affairs professionals in Spain to really show their value to corporate companies, to public organisations and others, to help senior leaders in business really understand potentially the new political realities in Spain. I think the other experience that I would flag up from recent years in the UK in terms of public affairs and multi-party politics is that it requires a public affairs professional to again be much more strategic about how they do public affairs. So there may be particular points in the political calendar that everybody knows about, and you may think we may do some activity on this point of the calendar and that point of the calendar. But I don't think that really works in a kind of coalition situation. You've got to think much more long term, much more about investing in these relationships for the long term. And also you've got to treat different parties equally and fairly. I think in the modern age, politics and political parties need to be a lot better at engaging with investors actually and kind of really reaching out to them and working with them to try and understand at least where each other is coming from. It may not change their position at the end of the day, but I think in some regards that kind of human relationship helps to put people in a much better position in terms of how they understand each other. and that might help to minimise some of the political risk. I think it's also important in a national context for businesses, large and small, to be proactive about engaging with new political parties. Transparency and openness is absolutely critical within the political context and within the commercial context as well. Political institutions, corporate institutions, public bodies are suffering a deficit of trust across the developed world and outside of that. So corporately, from a public affairs perspective, transparency needs to be really at the heart of any company's business strategy, as well as any company's values as well. It can't just be something which an organisation says on the outside, but the reality is very different. If a company or organisation doesn't put transparency at the heart of its strategy and its values from the top to the bottom, in these days where the communications landscape is so very different, I would suggest that those kinds of organisations are going to be fighting a losing battle, both in terms of protecting their reputation from a commercial perspective, but also, more importantly, in terms of winning the trust of consumers, of regulators, government, etc., and others, and the respect of the public. So, companies and organisations may get quite defensive naturally when something happens or when they're under attack. That's understandable, but the role of the public affairs professional is, I would suggest, to play a role to challenge senior leaders in the business or organisation internally, to try and help that organisation not to be defensive and to actually pose those questions, which are actually, could we do things in a different way? Could we do things better? Have we let our people down here? Have we let our consumers down? Do we need to have a different strategy in the future? So the public affairs professional has a role of bringing those stakeholder concerns from the outside world in, which are very real and valid, bringing those back into a company or organisation and presenting those with all the facts to senior leaders. So transparency in that regard, the public affairs professional has got a key role to